In a field that struggles with what to call itself and how to assign labels to its practitioners, Rahel Bailie has carved out a unique role for herself, Content Empress. The title started as a joke and as a way to distinguish her from a student who had already claimed the title Content Queen. But it truly fits. Rahel was one of the very first content folks to identify as a content strategist. She has pioneered many modern content practices, and she's widely regarded as the world's leading expert on content operations.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 86 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really delighted today to have with us Rahel Bailie. Rahel, in a field that's struggling sometimes with titles and identifications, Rahel has the perfect label for herself. She's the Content Empress. And I'm very delighted to welcome Rahel to the show. And Rahel, tell the folks a little bit more about your title and your work in the content world.
Well, the title started as a joke between me and one of my colleagues, because he said, you're the content queen. And I said, no, I can't be the content queen, because one of my students, her name is Irene, and so she calls herself Irene, the content queen. And so, sorry, I just, I'm a content plebe. And he went, no, you're the content empress then. And so that's kind of stuck. So other people have started using it. So it became it started as a joke, but it kind of distinguishes me, because I have started shying away from titles. Like, do I do content operations? Do I do content strategy? Am I a management consultant? Am I a digital transformation consultant? I'm the content empress. It incorporates all or any of those things that you want to put into there.
No, I think that's perfect, because we all struggle with the imprecision of these labels that we've got to identify ourselves. But I think most people would think of you, like if you made somebody identify you, they'd say, oh, she's a content strategist. Have you ever actually held that title? And I know you must have. So when did you first identify as such, as a content strategist?
Oh my goodness. I remember back in about 2001, 2002, calling myself a content strategist, but nobody knew what that meant. So they would say, well, no, we want somebody to help us figure out our content. So we want, a tech writer. And so I dropped that. And then I started calling myself a content management consultant, but then everyone thought I wrote code. And I thought, okay, no, I'm on the content side. And I do analyze content, and I think of systematizing content. So I went back to content strategy, and then content strategy became a thing. And so it kind of caught up with not just me, there were a number of us calling ourselves that. So I was calling myself a content strategist long before it was a popular term. But then it started in the UK. You've got content strategy and content design. And content design is where you actually create the content. So I design systems. I don't write content except example content. Like, here's how to apply your content model. This is how you would take this piece and chop it up. And so here they call those folks, like, who are really concerned about the UX of content, they call them content designers. So in North America, everyone was called a content strategist, whether you're a content designer over here or a content strategist over here. Over in North America, you are just a content strategist. And so it became really hard to distinguish between what I did and what other content strategists do. And some people still don't get it. There are agencies that really kind of go, and you do what? Because for them, if you look at a list of professions, and there's always right at the very bottom, it goes writing and editing. And that's what they think that all content people do is writing and editing. And so when you don't have that that context, you kind of shy away from the term and think, okay, what do I do? So
yeah. And we've all been struggling with that for literally decades now, and no resolution. But the work seems to be increasingly appreciated. Well, but this kind of brings me back around to why I wanted to have you on the show. I've been trying to make up an excuse for months. I've been trying to figure out how to get you on the show, and then you wrote this piece recently about the history of content strategy, and I thought, boom, that's it. That's how I can get my and I think a lot of this stuff we're talking about, like, how did we get here? How did we end up in this place where we have titles that are not precise? Like, what's going on? And one of the ways to look at that is historically, and to look back at the origins of the field. So tell me a little bit. Well, first of all, I'm curious, like you wrote this post and it's like, oh my God, it's like 10,000 words long. And you just sat down to just kind of do a bullet pointed list or something, right? Tell me about that. Yeah.
Well, a few years ago, about 10 years ago now, I guess, is Firehead on their site, firehead.net. So they're a content recruiting company. They wrote an article on the history of content strategy. And as soon as they wrote it, and the person who wrote it, I have to say, you know, she's got a good journalism background, but not really a content person, but she just did some research and she found a certain set of facts. But because she wasn't in the industry, there were a lot of things that were missing or she got wrong, or, you know, and a number of people got offended because they were left out, or because something had been misquoted, or the emphasis was in the wrong place. And they left it up, but had all these things in the comments. And my point was that nobody's going to read the comments, and they're going to start quoting this from the original article. And I was asked to do, so there's this organization called the Content Strategy Alliance, and they wanted to do a course on the history of content strategy, a short course, but you know, that introduction. And I thought, where do I send them? We don't have a book on the history of this profession. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to ask Firehead and, you know, CJ Walker, if I can take that and use it to flesh it out and incorporate the things from the comments and, you know, add in other things that I knew. And and I don't really come from that background. I have, you know, an academic background, but not a journalism background. And I started, it was amazing to me when I started, because I kept digging deeper and deeper, and this would lead me to that, and that would lead me to that. And then I would ask so-and-so a question, and then they would give me more information. And I was trying to kind of piece this all together, and it came out with, you know, 8,500 words or something like that. And I went, whoa, that was a month of my life. Okay, now I understand how much work goes into these long reads.
Right. And one of the things, I love that you started with the Vannevar Bush essay in 1945. That's like, I do think that's like that's kind of the origin document of like hypermedia and modern information architecture. And
it's true. I can't lay claim to that. It was Don Day who put that into a comment. So this is part of, I think, where me writing it came in handy, because I know people on the agency side and, you know, the pure play website and so on. And then I know people that come from that kind of technical background and that computing side and structured content. So Don Day came up with it, and I went, he's absolutely right. Way back then, when they didn't even have the means, they were thinking of, how do we do this?
Exactly. And I love that, because, well, and then when you wrote that article, I immediately after that, because two of the people who were most influenced by him are more modern, you know, they kind of brought it into the modern era, like Ted Nelson and his Xanadu project, and he invented the concept of hypertext and hypermedia, and
Right.
Then Doug Engelbart, but that kind of gets, but those two, like Ted Nelson was the hippie, you know, visionary, and Doug Engelbart was the mission-driven organizational dude. But that kind of gets into, like, there's a lot of antecedents to content strategy, like this sort of the visionary view of the future, which Engelbart had as well. He had this real strong vision of things. But, and like to what you just said, you've mentioned a few things already, like management consulting and technology. There's all these threads that come in because publishing used to just, content used to be about publishing stuff or making movies or whatever it was. And now we're in this situation where, is it this complexity? Is it this convergence of technology and stuff that makes content strategy necessary?
I'm glad you mentioned the word complexity, because it is exactly that. It's, if you think about, so I was there during the transition from writers writing things out and then giving them to typists to type up. And then they would send the proofs off to the printer and so on. And then we switched from that to word processing. And when you made that switch, all of a sudden things became possible, like these possibilities opened up, because it wasn't in a fixed format on a page, with whatever kind of linotype or whatever you use, right? So now it's something that you can link together in different ways, or if you needed to take out a sentence. We're having these discussions at Philips Electronics, where these were when computers were still made in Canada, and we would have these user guides that had to go with the books, had to go with the laptops. And when they came out with they had desktops, and then they came out with the laptop, and it was only one sentence per book that was changed. And the translators wanted to send it out, 9 different languages, the entire book to be translated again. And I said, it's only this one sentence that changed. Why don't we just change that one sentence and we can plop it in? You couldn't do that before. You would have to at least type over the page and so on. And we could just get these things in and out in no time by manipulating the text. And it was great. And when I discovered HTML, I was like, whoa, this is the way I think. And now there's a technology that can accommodate it, where there were other people who were very linear who really couldn't cope with that. I had one boss who said, like, this new fangled stuff is just going to make us into fancy proofreaders. And it's like,
I think to this day, people still struggle with that. It seems like that. And what you're getting at there is like that separation of content from its presentation. And that we live and swim in that all day. And it's just like second nature to us. But that's come slowly to other people.
There's an editorial side and a technical side to content. This is copy. So, copy is what people read. The technical side is what makes it into content. And so, you marry those two sides together and then you get content. So it's the copy plus the metadata, the copy plus the schema, the copy plus, all these underlying things. And if you don't have those underlying things, then you might as well write a note on a piece of paper and put it in somebody's pocket, because nobody's going to be able to find it.
Exactly. You're reminding me of, I haven't published it yet, but I had Nazir Bina on. Well, it'll be published by the time this comes out. I had Nazir Bina on the show last week, I think. And he talks about the difference between clay and Legos as your model for how to, and I know you two have worked together on stuff. Does that resonate with you? That seems like a perfect image.
Yes, and we often use Lego as an example of having content that's interoperable, because you can have a huge bucket of Lego and you know that they all fit together. You don't have to start figuring out which ones fit and which ones don't fit. So when you plan your content, you have to plan it in those same chunks. And this is why you have content models, because this gives you the form that you can use to build things. And so if you want it to be flexible and agile, then you need to honor and respect the form that you build it in. And some people will say, well, that's kind of, it's stifling our creativity, or, we don't want the content to be that prescribed. And it's like, the reason you can plug something in, you can buy something online and take it home and plug it in and know that it will work, is because there's a standard. Right?
Yep. And to that example you gave a few minutes ago of the manual changing, we have laptops now as well as desktops. So we have to republish the whole manual. Why don't we just,
exactly. And an agency would just say, oh, we have another campaign. Let's bring in another agency and bring them in, right? So, marketing department, for example, the tech commerce never had that luxury. They had to figure out how to make it work. And that's where you came up with your frame makers and your robo-helps and your, flares and all of those, that class of product. So the class of product for structured authoring for complex environments. So it's not about the fact that it happened to be technical content. It's that department that was starved and needed to scale. That's what I look at it as. And so they started doing content strategy way before anyone else knew what content strategy was, because they had to be able to just pump out reams and reams and reams of content. And so, I had this chat with a guy from Adobe, and he said, you take any website, 20% is marketing material, 80% is support material. It's your specs, it's your knowledge bases, it's your training, it's your how to get set up, it's all that kind of stuff that tech writers do. So how many people in marketing and what's their budget compared to how many people in tech com and their budget? So it's not the fact that it's technical documentation. If you were to flip it and you were to say, marketing, your budget's cut by 80%, tech com, your budget's increased by 80%, you would have seen these changes happening in marketing instead of in tech com.
Interesting. Well, that kind of gets to like the threads that make up the fabric of modern content strategy. You've got the technical stuff and both technical content strategy, but also like the rise of CMSs and the technical management of the editorial side of things. And then you have that marketing stuff going on. And then now increasingly the newest thread, I think, is this notion of product content strategy, the UX strings and all that. Do you see that all coming together, or will those threads still be identifiable, or will this all kind of converge at some point?
That opens such a can of worms, because if you think about it, UX writing used to be called embedded assistance, and tech writers did it. And then somewhere along the line, you had interaction design and things like that. And then you had UX people doing it, but of course they can't write. So now you've got UX writers who do it, but without the benefit of all the structured content. So we've kind of devolved into this area, so they can write on brand. Drives me crazy, because it's like, I don't want to see an oops, that's not your fault, it's ours, tell me what to do. Give me a tech writer who goes, actually, this is this problem, and it's because the developer was too lazy to fix it, so you need to go and do that. I mean, they don't say it that way, but they tell you what to do at least, because that's the way we were trained. So you've got things that are moving. They're moving in and out of different departments, and so now UX folks use Figma or one of these things to store these, and all the content that's in the prototypes gets stored in a silo, and then and it's built into different places, and you kind of go, well, what happened to all that single sourcing, to all that good stuff? So it's not being used anymore for that. It's being used for other stuff like API documentation and so on. So you've got it's a real time of flux right now. And I think actually the more complex it gets, the more you're going to need tech writers, because when you're doing AI strings, guess where they're stored? Excel spreadsheets, right?
I've seen them.
And they'll go like, oh, we figured out how to do this really efficiently in an Excel spreadsheet. And I just facepalm, because it's not really efficient. It would be efficient if that were in a repository with all the other strings, and you knew where everything was, and you could single source it and so on and so forth. Who knows how to do that? The tech writer. So at some point, they're going to have to get involved, because you're going to get people who will throw up their hands and go like, oh, that XML stuff, oh, boring. I don't want to deal with it. Like, well, fine.
Because there's a whole bunch in what you just said. First of all, I want to have you go back a little bit and define single sourcing, because I think that's such an important concept in the tech content world. That's and it kind of gets to what you're talking about, that like a canonical repository to work from would be the ideal. And the UX folks are just, Well, there's at least a plugin for Figma now that can handle text strings independently of the design process. But there's still obviously some work to do there. But talk a little bit about single sourcing, and that's in the importance of that idea.
Okay, so they used to call it definitive source of truth or single source of truth, or various other terms. So here's a little story from a gig that I did at a bank where they had interfaces where a developer had to go in and change a word. So if you changed it from log on to log in, you told the developer, and he would go in and he would find all the places and he would update it. And then that got really boring. So he built a little interface where somebody could go in and change that themselves, and it would change it all over the place. Single sourcing. However, it was in a silo. So you say, okay, so when you change that from log on to log in, how does that change in all of the online help? Oh, I never thought about that. How long have you been doing this? 7 years. 7 years, he hadn't thought about all of the disconnects between his silo and the big body of documentation. But we know how to do this. I mean, we've been doing it for years. So, you throw something into, I hate to use the word DITA because then there are going to be people who right away go, oh yeah, they're pushing DITA again. But I mean, it's the best standard we have right now. So this is the one I'm plugging. So you would put it in there, and there was a field for that. And you could draw it from, into the 100 places you had to put it. And when you needed to change it, you change it there. It would change in your documentation and in your interface. It would change in your code and everywhere. And so, we've known how to do this since the 1990s. But that has been lost. Everyone wants, oh, XML, that's so old, so boring. Can't we have something more modern? Can't we have something that's like, can't we do it with JSON? Can't we, and you kind of go, oh, isn't there a cool company that's doing this? And I'm going, you know what? I'm relatively well connected in the industry, and I talk to these writers, and it's a shit show in the back end. They might go to these conferences and go, ta-da! But, it's all binder twine and mechanical Turks in the background.
Yep.
And I think what's happened is that the COVID crisis exposed everybody's dirty laundry. Because when you look at someplace like PayPal that could pivot on a dime, why? They have structured content. They have a single source of truth. They went from being a small business. That's where they make the money, really, is small businesses that use PayPal as a payment gateway. So when it became, hey, there's no payments happening because everyone's in lockdown and losing their jobs, but the government is giving these relief funds, we can turn ourselves on a dime into the relief fund provider to the small businesses because they all have accounts with us. We have to write a bit of content, structure it, push it out, done. And then you have other places who are like, COVID, we need COVID information tomorrow. We need 3 agile teams working 80 hours a week for 5 weeks. Yay, we did it. And you think, you know what? If you had listened 6 months ago when somebody said to you, you need to get your content in order, you're racking up too much content debt, they wouldn't have been exposed. But, we in the industry, we can look at that and go, yeah, they didn't have theirs in order. Look how long it took them. Look at that.
That's an interesting thing to me.
The bodies are buried.
Yeah, so much of this has been figured out. And I sometimes feel that we're, as a discipline, as a professional practice, we could be communicating. Like as soon as you talked about that PayPal story, I'm like, can you write a white paper or a blog post about that so I can point? Because people are always asking me for examples of like, yeah, that all sounds great, Larry, but what's the point? And I'm like, well, you can pivot on a dime like PayPal did and capitalize on, and take advantage of this situation, or you can spend a couple $1 million on developers. It's like your choice,
Yeah.
Can you speak to that about like how the selling of content strategy or, yeah.
You have to sell it on, cost savings. So what it used to be that you couldn't sell it on internal rate of return. So, you can either ROI, you can spend money to make money, or you can spend money to save money. So ROI versus IRR. So you couldn't sell it on IRR before. They would say, it doesn't matter if it takes somebody 100 clicks to do something. And that was the case at one client. That it was appalling. 100 clicks to get an image online. Well, it doesn't really matter because, we've got people doing that and that's fine. Like if they're suffering, but we don't have to spend money, we're okay with it. Where we want to spend money is on the things where, it means somebody will buy this product. Okay, fine. Now, when they look at the cost, because more complexity means you need more resources. So do you want to hire another 100 people, another 200 people? Do you want to spend another $1.5 million? Do you want to spend another 5 million on bringing the resources to maintain the content? So it's not even that content creation, because if you think of content as a supply chain, I create it, I publish it, we're done. So that's kind of like the marketing thing, right? They don't really reuse campaigns. It's like, we did a campaign, now we're done, park that, let's do the next one. Okay, fine. But in the other 80%, you are churning through content, version 2, version 12, version 24, version 48. And if you don't get it right at the beginning, now you're updating 48 versions across 4 product lines. Naz and I, in our book, we said there was one example where by the time you're done with, in this many products and that many products and that many product lines and in that many countries and that many variants, 12,000 times that piece of content gets used, or those 4 pieces of content get used. So when you take that and you kind of go, all right, now I've created this content and now I have to update it. So first of all, I have to go and find the content. Then I have to check around to make sure that's the actual latest content. And then I have to do all the things I would do when I create it. And now I have to do that 12 times because we've got 12 versions of it, right? Because of either 12 countries or 12 markets or 12 products or whatever it may be. So you have the cost of original content creation, the cost of the maintenance, and then the cost of the publishing. Because once you've actually done all the maintenance on it, the cost of pushing it out through your CMS is relatively cheap.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting, this comes up a lot, is sort of the accounting of content. Like, I know you've talked about this, and Naz and Cruz Saunders talked about like the importance of looking at content as a valuable asset. But I don't think accountants look at it that way. There's no place in the balance sheet. There's plenty of places in the P&L to account for content creation costs and content management costs. But like, why aren't we showing up as I think we should in the balance sheet for a company? What's going on there?
Well, this is the interesting part, is that going back to your point about product content, if you don't have content, you don't have a product. Like in a lot of cases, no content equals no product. If you took all the content out, you're left with a bunch of pretty colors and lines and a couple of images, if you don't count images as content, which, we do if they have meaning. So, what do? You have to have content. And so when you kind of put it that way, do you know who Salim Ismail is?
Oh, I know the name.
University. I've met him many, many years ago. And
he's the info enablement, or what's the term he uses?
Information enablement, right? Yeah. So he says, if you want to grow, especially if you want to grow exponentially, you have to have information enablement. Not going to tell you how to do it because everybody does it differently, but you have to be able to enable your information. So your information is content plus data. So content and data is information. So you have to be able to use your data really quickly, smart, get insights and so on. You have to be able to use your content to communicate, and you have to be able to get it out there. And if it's in your product, you have to have that. You have to be on the ball with that. You can't be, fiddling around in some corner and somebody goes on vacation. It's like, oops, I locked it in my Google Drive. Oh, that won't fly. You have to have, and developers will tell you, use GitHub. But content is not code. And that falls apart pretty quickly. And so you need to have proper production grade content tools. And we don't. We use tools meant for casual business use, Word, Google Docs.
Well, that's interesting, because that's another convergence of threads that I think could be given more attention, because what you're just talking about, because there are editorial systems that have like version control and stuff like that, and collaboration things, and the way GitHub works, it's just like a developer model for how to do that kind of stuff.
But that's what they know, so that's what they're going to recommend.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Realize, I say data is easy because a number in a spreadsheet is a number in a spreadsheet. As soon as you say that number equals, like 12 equals December, what does that mean? Now there's a bunch of meaning to it, right? It's December, it could be Christmas, it could be Independence Day. It could mean the tourists are coming. It could mean I need to book early. It could mean I'm going skiing. It could mean so many things. And, you put two numbers together, you've got two numbers. You can add them, multiply them, whatever. You put two sentences together, you've got, who knows, sexism, racism, because there's nuance, there's meaning, there's layers of meaning to it that you don't have with data. So you have to manage it differently. There are two different things. The fact that they happen to both get published on a web page or in a database somewhere, that's incidental.
No, and you're getting at like some of the biggest threads that I think it's like so much the human stuff. It's the human stuff and the technical stuff coming together. And we're in a culture, especially a business culture, where the tech folks seem to have a little, financial and numbers advantage over the content folks. And how do you reconcile that? Like, how do we get that?
Oh my gosh. If I told you how many times that they wanted to send in a consultant from, name your big consultancy, who knows content, and I ask questions and I can tell you they don't know squat. They know data, but they don't know content. And they want to bring them in because they're from a big name agency. And you think they're just going to come in and make a mess. And then we're going to still be in that same mess. And the writers and the content designers are still going to be suffering because it's just a different mess. Because even if they go and they ask them questions, they're not asking the right questions. They don't know the fundamental underpinnings of content to be able to say, let's remediate this.
Yeah. How do you educate people to have that? Somebody who comes to content strategy from journalism or someplace and say, oh, and here's what you need to know to win that argument or to make that case.
It's really hard because the biggest gatekeepers are often technologists. They will argue. One guy who's like had a little small team, and they were going to sort out, like do natural language translations in many languages. It's like, okay, Google has hundreds of people working on this, and they know that they're not going to crack this code, but you're going to crack this code? Oh, right. Yeah. Tell me about it. But when you would say to them, actually, you know what, maybe we should just clean up the fundamentals first. And I was like, oh, no, that's boring. That's boring. We don't want to do that. Let's do the shiny stuff. And it becomes really frustrating. So to explain it to somebody, it's like, okay, well, it's like saying, explain to me how to be a doctor. Just like,
yep.
And give me your elevator pitch. Tell me how to do plastic surgery. It's like, yeah.
No, I get that. No, and that gets it. I think this is kind of getting back to the origins of the discipline. Like, it's a necessary discipline because of all these interlinking complexities that are, like, you just reminded me when you talked about NLP, that one of the newer threads, or the newest threads that I'm discovering and exploring about content strategy, is the idea of conversation design and voice user interfaces and
automatic writing. That's the next one. They're not going to deal with content people at all because it's all going to be automatic writing.
Yep. Oh, and the techies are going to glom onto that right away.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But I spend a lot of my time going, no,
Yeah. No, but to what you were just talking about, that example you just gave of like convincing the guy with the 5-person tech team that he's going to compete with Alexa or, or some, like something like that. That ain't going to happen. I just learned recently, there's 12,000 people working on Alexa, probably half of whom are developers. It's like, that's just one, and Google and Bixby and yeah.
The funny thing was, like, even though they're talking about this translation, it's like, okay, who do you think writes the original strings? The people who report to me. And they have an Excel spreadsheet.
Right. Well, it always comes back to spreadsheets in this world. But in that world, in the voice interface world, and this is something I'm just prying relentlessly to get to, is like the content that they're doing. It's like they'll do some natural language understanding to understand a query, and then some magic AI thing in the background, and then they'll do some natural language generation and spit out some content. And I'm like, well, that seems really useful. Can we use that elsewhere? Or how are we integrating that? How are we aligning it with our style, with our other content? Have you had to deal with that at all? Or
yes, and that's a whole other podcast. I'll give you the name of somebody.
Okay.
Them on it.
Yeah, but again, I guess the general point is that this is some crazy complex stuff, and we're just all doing our best to stitch it together. And
this is the funny thing is, I don't have a master's degree or a PhD. I've got a bachelor's, and even in that, it was before the internet. So really, it was just about. I finished my degree about the time the internet came about, about the time the web came about. So it doesn't really have anything to do with what I actually do for a living. I was like creative writing and women's studies, like go figure. But nobody teaches this stuff anywhere, right? So when you have to start doing it, you kind of go, okay, where do I learn this? Well, the universities aren't teaching it yet. So you have to learn it on your own, or learn it from people, or learn it by, in my case, supervising people who are telling me what the problems are. And from that, I extrapolate the theories, find it. And then you go and you know it so well after a while that you can start teaching it because you've been there, done that. And now somebody's teaching it, right? So content strategy has been a little bit like that. Is that the people who are teaching it now, we figured it out on our own because there was no place to learn it. In fact, there's still only one place in the world to get a master's degree in.
Right, Robert's program in Graz, right?
Yeah,
that's it. But what about, you mentioned earlier the Content Strategy Alliance. Have you all done any work there on curriculum, or like what a program might look like if somebody did offer it?
Yeah, they are putting together a curriculum right now. I've written 2 modules. I'm writing a 3rd module for it. So they are putting together. So I'm doing like the history of, and then the content introduction to content strategy, like what is content strategy, and then when they go into kind of the fundamentals, the foundation courses about inventories and audits and analysis and so on, and then it gets more into kind of some technical stuff. And they're going to have that certified through an American certification body. So it'll be, you can get kind of accreditation in it.
So there's accrediting bodies for accrediting bodies. I love how meta that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, outside of the United States, like I teach a 2-day course here in the UK, and we have it accredited through the UK accrediting body. So if you want to do your, like, how if you're a project manager and you need to take a certain number of credits per year, and they can be on anything. So this body decides which things you can take and get credit for. So people can take my course and get credit for it, So that's the kind of body that they're working through in the US. But it's a bunch of people that came together and said, we should have an association. We are losing out by not having an association.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's like you go to a project manager and you go, okay, I need somebody with a Prince 2 certification. You know why you need it, you know what it is, and you know what that person's supposed to be able to do. So if they can't deliver on it, you have a benchmark against which you can measure it. But we don't have that because we don't have an association.
And the content strategy, so that's the closest we have right now. And that's,
Yeah.
I know that that's not like it's not like a paid membership thing or anything. It's pretty low key at this point. Is there plans, are there plans to expand it or?
Well, once they have this accreditation program, I think it will start to take off, because a lot of people came together. They donated their templates from their work. They, a lot of us who are seasoned professionals, and we have a kind of a vested interest in knowing that somebody has that accreditation, that they know what they're talking about. And I remember when usability first started, like that whole thing in the late 1990s, and you wanted to know. I remember asking somebody about wired like in for a set of wireframes. I got something different, and I was like, that's not a wireframe. Well, yes, it is. Well, in his world, it was, but in my world, it wasn't. And so now we know, like, you hire an information architect or a UX designer, and you know what they should be able to deliver. And when they come with their portfolio, they're showing you what you expect to see. But in content strategy, what are you going to show? A bunch of spreadsheets with everything redacted in it because you're under NDA. So how do you know that the person knows at least the theory behind it?
Right. No, and I love that you're doing that you're teasing out those individual skills that make up the practice and able to articulate it in a way that, like, yep, we accredit you can do this. And so that, assuming that takes hold and we have a bunch of accredited, kind of folks pretty much on the same page practicing content strategy, what do you see as the future? I know we started with the history, but now I'm really curious about the future of content strategy. What do you think our prospects are?
Well, I think that it's going to become, we talked about complexity, and things are getting more and more complex. Right now, the holy grail is personalization and growth and scale. And you can't do that without a sound strategy. Like, you just can't. And there are people who go like, we don't pay for strategies, or we don't believe in strategies. Well, if you don't believe in planning, it's like, think of something that's more traditional, a car. So if you don't have a plan for the car, you could end up with a steering wheel on the roof because somebody decided, let's stick it up there. And it's like, yeah, whatever. Okay, good. Right. You could, like, what makes a car, what makes it possible for you to go to a car at a rental place and get the keys and get in and just kind of do a quick check and go, because kind of what to expect. But they planned that out. It didn't just happen by magic. And people who say that we don't want a content strategy, well, how do you think this is going to happen? By magic? The little fairy dust, the little content fairies will come and sprinkle fairy dust, and voila, you have a strategy. So there's a lot that goes into a strategy, particularly when it's a more complex. So if you're the local dry cleaner, you don't need a content strategy. Although, you know what? My content queen, Irene, she did a content strategy for my hairdresser because she wanted to come to London and experience content strategy. And he owns 2 businesses, and they're, one's like for women's hairdressing and one's for men's hair systems, when they're balding. And so, he's got quite a good concern on there. We had to kind of separate the 2 brands, and we had to, have the messaging architecture, and we, so she did a full thing on there. So, that's from the very basic for a small business. You can imagine once you get into the multinationals, how complex that could be. Or where
and it's probably not a straight line. It's probably a logarithmic scale of complexity and issues. And like when you're talking about and you've mentioned a couple things that, like, first, just localization as a concern. Like, that's a huge argument for a lot of this stuff we've been talking about. And now personalization, this kind of a current trend. Do you see other stuff coming up that'll help us make our case? Like, boy, if you'd had a content strategy, it sure would have been a lot easier to make that transition.
Oh, yes. So I did a content strategy a number of years ago for a company that had, think of them as a mini Amazon. So you know how Amazon is going into certain verticals, they're going into building supplies, they're going into healthcare and so on. So this company had, a few 100,000 products. They were going to go to over 500,000 or 750,000 products over a certain staggered. And they asked me, how much do you think you can kind of get us ahead? And I went like probably 5%, thinking probably 10%, but I don't want to overstate it. So let's say 5% conservatively. And, they had this mantra that was every 5%, it equals 50 million pounds. So
Wow.
when they heard 5%, ding, 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 ding. And I just looked at things like, okay, you don't have any schema. So of course, none of your content's going to come up in search because you don't have any schema tags on there. You can't come up in the shopping thing because you don't have certain things in there. You have this system. So you can design a building or design a something. And there's so many, like let's call it that. It's very sophisticated, and you have all sorts of people working on this together so that you don't, run your beams through the elevator shaft by accident, right? So it's like, so while you're doing that, you are picking your materials. A material for them is not, they're not at a store. They're picking it by a part number, by an image, by specs, by a short description, by a long description, by all your attributes, because now it's not just, I'm going to put up this drywall and have this insulation. It's like, if you use this drywall, you have to use that insulation because you are required by law to have an energy rating of 85%. Right? So it's become very sophisticated. All that is content. It's all content. And if you don't have your ducks in a row, if you don't have it structured to the nth degree, you can't feed your content into a system like that. So by necessity, you have to do that. So it's like, well, do you have a product or don't you have a product?
No, that's perfect. That's Hey, Rahel, I noticed I usually try to keep these around a half hour. We've gone a little bit over that, but I'm totally fine with that. But I do want to keep it on the reasonable length side, and I could talk to you forever about this stuff. But before we start to wrap up, I just want to make sure: is there anything that's on your mind about content strategy, or just in general about the internet and the state of things, or just anything that's come up in the conversation that you want to follow up on?
Well, there's something that was a big aha moment for me recently. And I've been talking about content operations for decades. But I think that was a term that used to go in one ear and out the other because people didn't really have any mental model for it. But now that we have DevOps and design ops and user ops and, everything has an ops now. Why do we do a content strategy? I can create you, a strategy is basically a plan. So I can create you a strategy, give it to you, you pay me, and then you put it in a drawer that's worthless because it's sitting in a drawer. Why do you do it? Because you want to operationalize your content. So we do content strategy for content ops. And content ops until now has been that techie, boring, whatever stuff, but it needs to have its place in the sun. And that's kind of my mission for the next 5 years, is to put content operations on the map and show how operationalizing your content will help you scale, grow, manage your risk, have better user experience, more personalization, better brand trust, and all of that good stuff.
Right. Hey, and one thing I want to maybe just put in a plug for you being preemptively, I'm already starting to see content ops sort of equated to old publishing processes, just like, hey, I got an idea, let's develop it, let's do it, and just kind of that unilinear flow thing of content, whereas genuine content strategy-based content ops is more than that. Are you already thinking about how to address that? Or?
Yes, I use traditional management consulting techniques of a gap analysis. First of all, what do you need? You don't want to over-engineer it. You don't want to under-engineer it. You have to have the right things for the right tools. So if you're a journalism company or a newspaper company, you're going to have a completely different operational model than what we just talked about with the design building software. And you're going to have a different thing if you're an e-commerce retailer. You're going to have a completely different operational model if you're doing, you've got a lot of UX content. So each thing that you do is going to have a slightly different need. And then you have to build a model that takes into account all of those little pockets of content in your organization. And that's going to be a different size for each one. Do you need that operationalized or not? That kind of thing.
And that speaks to this need for a bunch of accredited, highly skilled people out there to do that. If it's all going to be bespoke every time you do it, you want to have that. Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much. One last thing. What's the best place for folks to stay in touch with you? What's social media, or where do you like to connect with folks?
Well, I'm
Sorry, we had a Zoom problem. Just as Rahel was sharing her social media info, she's Rahel AB, as in Rahel Anne Bailie, Rahel letter A, letter B, on most social platforms.
Things on SlideShare under that same tag. I'm on Medium under that same tag. So you can find me in most places under that tag.
Okay, great. I'll get those in the show notes as well. Well, thanks again, Rahel. Great conversation. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.